Hi everyone, it's James here with another Biome Bite. Today we're going to be talking about what the microbiome is, something we've spoken a lot about on the podcast so far, but I haven't really dug into in really much detail what it is, why it's important, what it does. So in today's episode, I'm going to give an overview of the microbiome. So the term microbiome refers to all the microorganisms that exist within a particular environment, all of their genes, also known as their genomic potential, and all the things which are produced by the microorganisms as part of their metabolism. Essentially, their theatre of functional activity. You can think of them a little bit like an orchestra. All the microorganisms, slightly different, playing different instruments, but they produce a sound. And that sound is, in this context, the collective product or products of their metabolism. Think of them as little chemical factories. And they require foodstuffs to produce the products of their metabolism, and they get that from us as their host and what we put into our mouths and into our digestive tract. So the microbiome is the term used to describe all of that. And typically we insert something before microbiome when we're talking about a specific area of the body, like the gut, for example, the gut microbiome. But really, wherever there is a niche, there's probably microorganisms. So there's many different microbiomes in the body. And actually, there's microbiomes everywhere, absolutely everywhere on the planet. There's a sink microbiome, a toilet microbiome. There's a microbiome in your bed. There's a microbiome in the coral reefs, microbiome in forest, microbiome on Monroe's, mountains, you name it, there's a microbiome there. But Inside Matters is all about gut health and human health, so we're going to keep it focused there for now. The densest concentration of microorganisms, i.e. the most densely populated microbiome in the body, is in the gut. And to give you an idea of scale, there are more microorganisms in your gut than there are grains of sand on all the beaches of planet Earth. There are more microorganisms in your gut than there are stars in the galaxy. And some kind of crazy facts associated with that. If you think about the number of cells within the human body, there are just as many microorganisms as there are human cells. So some people like to say things like you're less than 50% human. And it depends really on when you go to the loo as to whether or not at any one point in time you're more microbial or more human. So essentially, passing a bowel movement makes you less microbial than human. And prior to that, you're more microbial than human, which is fascinating. And in terms of the number of genes, this is also really interesting too. So something like 20,000 roughly genes that make up the human genome. And there are a variety of estimates that have been produced by researchers around the world as to how many genes are in your microbiome. And they range from kind of low millions to, in some cases, some researchers have said there's an almost infinite number. So huge genetic diversity within the microbiome. That's really exciting because all these genes code for proteins. And these proteins might be therapeutically active. So it might be that the cure or the cures for all diseases known to man lie within us. The cure lies within us. And we mentioned the Milky Way and the galaxy and the stars. These are the stars that are within the human body. Now, you might have heard of things like the microbiota and thought, what is the difference between the microbiota and the microbiome? Often the two terms are used interchangeably, and it's not really too bad to do that. But classically, typically, the term microbiota refers to the microorganisms themselves, rather than their products of metabolism and their collective genomic potential. And you might have also heard of things like mycobiome, M-Y-C-O, biome, virome, in the context of the microbiome. What are they? The microbiome refers to all the fungi that exist within the within the microbiome. And actually, going back a step, what is the relative composition of microorganisms within the microbiome? It's not just bacteria. It's viruses, which can be viruses that have adapted to infect humans, or they can be even smaller viruses that have adapted to infect bacteria. These are called bacteriophage. And I've heard people say things like, for every one bacteria in the microbiome, there's up to 10 phage. So that just gives you an idea of scale around how many phage there are in the microbiome. In addition to that, there's the fungi, who were on the planet way before us, and they represent an important part of our microbiome as well. So it's interspecies. It's a kind of kingdom. It's an ecology of multiple different living things. You can argue about viruses being alive or dead. And they make up the microbiome. Which part is more important than the other? Well, we don't really know. Some people say, well, the bacteria are the metabolically active component, therefore they're the most important. Other people who study different parts would make a strong case for why the microbiome is the most important, why the virome is most important. Truth be told, we've done a lot more research on the bacterial component than we have other components. And that's because historically it's been easier to study the bacterial components. Our tools and techniques available to study the microbiome have improved vastly over the last 10 or so years. The invention of next generation sequencing technology and the application of the next generation sequencing technology to the microbiome has allowed us to study the microbiome in people, both patients and healthy people, healthy controls we sometimes call them, at a much more rapid scale and a much more cost-effective way or means than previously, where we had to essentially use culture plates and laboriously streak out bacteria onto plates, let them grow, watch them grow, so on and so on. So hopefully over the next 10, 15, 20 years, we'll start to identify which part of the microbiome or parts of the microbiome are more important in the context of various different diseases than others. Why would that be useful? Well, if it turns out that actually the phage are the most important part of the microbiome in the development of, for example, autism, then we might be able to selectively target the phage and change the composition in that way. Whereas right now our tools are more blunt rather than being super, super precise. So, we've talked about the microbiome. We've talked about what it's composed of. We've talked about the differences between various different parts of the microbiome. But we've not talked about what the microbiome does in healthy people and potentially diseases. So, in healthy people, the microbiome does many things. And in unhealthy people, it also does many of these things, but sometimes some of the function may have changed. So it protects us from harmful invaders. It acts in a way that essentially pushes out foreign invaders from entering in and staying in the body, something called colonization resistance. It produces vitamins. It helps us digest food. It trains the immune system and helps the immune system function from early life, actually. And all day, every day, so long as we're alive, there's an interaction happening between the immune system and the microorganisms. And sometimes that interaction goes wrong. And we think that that might be the trigger or the cause or the driver of things like inflammatory bowel disease, where we have such dense immune system innervation and such dense microbial population. A change to the composition of the microbes changes the interaction between the microbes and the immune system for the worse. And that's why we think that in addition to suppressing the immune system, which is how we've historically treated inflammatory bowel disease, changing the microorganisms might actually change the trigger. It might stop what's driving the disease processes and the abnormal interaction between the microorganisms and the immune system more generally. The microorganisms may also communicate with the brain, And products of their metabolism, some of which have never really been characterized, might have other aspects on our physiology, which again, we haven't fully characterized. What we know is that the microbiome changes in patients with disease. And there's some trends that we typically observe. One trend is that the diversity of microorganisms, so the number of different strains or species, and the evenness of their spread changes. And what we typically see is a reduction in diversity. One analogy which commonly gets used is we go from a rainforest with lots of flowers and plants and life to a more desert-like picture where there's less life. A key question is that the driver or the passenger? Is that the chicken or the egg? Is it the change to the microbiome that's driving the disease processes and maybe causing the disease, influencing the severity, or is it all that disease process influencing the microbiome? Truth be told, we don't have a clear-cut answer. And it probably is the case that for some diseases, it's more of a driver than a passenger, and in others, it's more of a passenger than a driver. We know that the microbiome performs these functions because we can breed animals without microbiomes. They're born in bubbles with no microbiome at all, and they're not really very healthy at all. And we also can compare microbiomes in different areas of the body with healthy people versus people who've got a particular disease and see, okay, what's different about the person who's got the disease to the person that's healthy, and try and deconstruct that. We're also able to pull out single strains of microorganisms or viruses or fungi, grow them up, and then analyze what they produce in various different cell models and so on. So that's how we increase our understanding of why the microbiome is important in health, but also in disease. Now, there's a variety of different ways you can change your microbiome. We talk about that all the time on Inside Matters. We talk about fecal microbiota transplantation, also known as FMT. We talk about prebiotics, food substances that typically are not broken down by us and can only be digested by microorganisms, and that promote the growth, the survival of generally what are described as beneficial bacteria. And we talk about probiotics, which are strains or species, singular, or given in multiple doses, which confer some sort of health benefit to the host. So quote unquote good bacteria. There's combinations of the two, also known as symbiotics. Now, we're not going to go into the detail in any of those areas in this podcast, but I think it's just worth mentioning those as things that we talk about a lot on the podcast. There's also things that maybe harm the microorganisms, like antibiotics. And there's more experimental type things like phage cocktails, so suspensions of these tiny viruses that infect other bacteria, and other more experimental approaches as well. So there we go, overview of the microbiome. As always, I'm happy to take any questions. Please email me at james@insidematters.health. Connect with me on social media. Please like, subscribe, share. Really appreciate the support. Thank you.